And to get us on our way, and always in a presentation I always find riveting, which is an update of all the water projects in the GCC. So if you're looking at opportunities, things that have been built and things that are going to be built in the water sector in the GCC, you need look no further, the MEAD projects. So to update us on this project stream, I'm very pleased to welcome my friend Ed James. He's Director of Analysis at MEAD Projects. So please welcome Mr. Ed James.
Thank you, Eddie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honour to be invited back here to speak about water investment and projects in the GCC. Now, I've got about 15 minutes to give you an overview of the projects market for water sector and a little bit of power as well in the GCC, 6 GCC states. So it is going to be fairly rapid. There is a lot of data here. If you want this presentation, please just give me your card afterwards, your business card, and I'll aim to email it to you once I get back into the office. Now, I work for MEAD Projects. MEAD Projects is a project tracking service, just in case you're wondering. We track all major projects in the region, and by tracking these projects, we're able to quantify the size of different markets and countries in terms of productivity. And here is just such data, and you can see here, this is the value of all contracts and projects awarded in the GCC from 2008 to 15, and you can see quite clearly here that this is, no, laser pen not working. Well, you can see quite clearly that Saudi Arabia and UAE are the 2 largest project markets in the GCC. This is for all sectors, by the way, not just water, power, this is all sectors, followed by Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and then Bahrain. And that between 2008 and 15, there were more than $1.2 trillion worth of projects awarded in the GCC. So a huge amount of investment ongoing in the GCC region. Now, let's take that same data and split it down by sector. And you can see here that the largest single sector in the GCC by a long way is construction, followed by transport. But we can see here the power and the water sectors, or towards the right-hand side, that they constitute a fairly large segment of investment each year. So the power sector in the GCC, we have between $10 and $15 billion worth of new projects awarded every year, and a little less in the water sector. But compared with some other sectors, such as oil and gas, the interesting thing about power and water generally in the region is that they are fairly stable year on year, and that's because, generally speaking, power and water sector investment is driven by demographic growth. Demographic growth has been fairly steady, although quite high in the region over the last few years, and as a result, the amount of investment required in the 2 sectors is fairly stable, and therefore you get a fairly stable amount of investment each year. However, lower oil prices have started to affect the projects market. Again, this is all sectors, and last year was pretty terrible. In fact, it was the worst year since 2005 for the projects market in the GCC. Overall spending on projects in the region fell from $178 billion in 2015 to just $109 billion last year, with the UAE being by far the largest market. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait projects markets collapsed last year as lower oil prices affected government revenues, and governments stopped spending on projects as a result. And here you can see the difference year on year. You can see Saudi Arabia spent less than half what it spent in 2015 on projects. Qatar, less than half. Kuwait, maybe a third of what it spent in 2015. Oman, less than half. Only the UAE, led primarily by Dubai, spent anywhere near what it spent in 2015. So well down last year. And unfortunately, that is also the same story for the power and water sectors. in fact, for power and water sectors together, it was the worst year for project investment or new projects since 2005. And again, that's really because of government pressures on government budgets and that impact that had on new project spending in the region. There were some significant projects, but both power and water, along with every other sector, fell quite considerably. Now, this is quite interesting because the traditional or historic trend of thought in the region has been that because demand growth rates are so high, that investment in power and water would remain stable because governments don't have a choice whether or not to invest in new desalination plants or new power plants. They have to in order to maintain supply in line with demand. However, we can see here that last year at least wasn't the case. We saw a big drop year on year in investment in those two sectors. Now, just in terms of key data and key statistics, this graph or this chart is based on official data. We are quite fortunate in the GCC in that most of the state utilities in the region are fairly transparent with their data, albeit there's normally a lag. You have to wait a year for the previous year's results. But you can see here the installed desalination capacity for 2015 for most of the GCC states, peak water demand forecast based on our estimates, and the amount of new capacity required over the next 5 years or so. You can see that by a big margin, Saudi Arabia, as you might expect, is the largest desalination market in terms of installed capacity in the region, followed by Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, of course, has to exports a lot of its produced desalinated water to the Northern Emirates, FIWA, and a little bit to Siwa as well. Followed by Kuwait, Dubai, and then Qatar, Bahrain, Oman. Each state, by and large, with some exceptions, has water demand below desalination capacity. Bear in mind also that this only takes into account desalination capacity and not other sources of water such as potable water, such as groundwater. We are expecting to see a large increase in peak water demand as demand growth continues to rise. And as a result, we anticipate at least nearly 2 billion imperial gallons a day, or 2,000 MIGD of new desalination capacity required by 2020. So that's a very large amount of new capacity required, about just under half of what's currently installed. And that's new capacity just based on forecast demand. It doesn't include replacement of existing capacity that's aging and needs to be replaced. So a large amount of investment going to be required going forward. We can see actually the largest source of new capacity is actually going to be in Kuwait, according to estimates, and we're going to hear from Engineer Suhaila and MEW in the next presentation. Okay, so what are some of the key water-focused projects currently under construction in the GCC? And we can see a lot of them are IWPs or IWPPs. We have the biggest one, Soha, the IWP there, then the Merfa IWPP, Facility D in Qatar, and we also have had some fairly large investments in pipelines, pumping stations. So we got the Strategic Tunnel Enhancement Program in Abu Dhabi. We got the NWC Wassia Water Project, which is a groundwater project in Saudi. The Doha Desalination Plant, Phase 1 in Kuwait. The sewage treatment plant in Qatar, Al Dakhira. Just down the road in Jebel Ali, we have a new sewage treatment plant being built, and so on. And next slide gives an overview of the top future GCC projects in the water sector coming up. We've got the largest one being the Jubail 3 IDBPP, a huge project. Now, obviously, a large chunk of that figure, $5.3 billion, is going to be the power island or the power element, but still it's going to be a large desalination component. For the Ministry of Electricity and Water in Kuwait, we have the Nuwaisib IWPP. I'm sure we'll hear about that later. The Al Dur 2 IWPP in Bahrain. The Shuaib South desalination plant in Kuwait. The Hamen wastewater treatment plant expansion in Kuwait. That's being done on a PPP basis, and that's under evaluation right now. Ras Al Khair, desalination plant phase 2. Rabig facility E in Qatar. The Al Zor North 2 IWPP, bids are under evaluation for that, hopefully waiting for an award soon. That's another PPP project in Kuwait, and so on. And then just the list continues. A very interesting project which is currently out to bid and tender, which is the Jebel Ali stormwater drainage system. This is for the Expo and Al Maktoum International Airport site. Consists of 4 main packages, including some very deep, wide and long tunnels to collect stormwater and transmit that into the sea. The Ras Al Fontas RAF A4 desalination plant bids under evaluation, and again various other desalination, water treatment, transmission projects. Some in design, some in bid, some under evaluation, and so on. Obviously, not all these projects will go ahead, but nonetheless, it gives you a scale of the size and ambition of the amount of investment required in the region over the next few years. So, in terms of the value of GCC power and water projects, well, in terms of the known pipeline of future projects in the region, we've got some $170 billion worth of future power and water projects in the region. Saudi Arabia, as you might expect, biggest demand, biggest population, biggest economy, is the largest single future market in the region, followed by Kuwait and the UAE and Oman, Qatar and Bahrain. Again, not all these projects will happen, but nonetheless, this is a fairly substantial pipeline. And this will probably grow because as of yesterday, we've heard of Saudi Arabia's plan for nuclear and renewable energy, which we have to add to the pipeline. In terms of how that's split up, in terms of the pipeline of projects, well, the vast majority, more than $100 billion, is earmarked for generation projects, so that would be desalination, new power plants, generation, new power generation, desalination, standalone desalination, more than $20 billion, transmission pipelines, more than $20 billion, and then treatment and storage projects as well. So just running out of time, so the next 3 minutes, just going to go through some of the qualitative issues. What are some of the drivers for growth? Well, despite lower oil prices, population growth is still growing. Populations are still growing in the region, and demand growth is still increasing. There's still substantial demand growth for more power and water, and as a result, governments have to maintain or continue investing in power and water facilities. Another major driver is the move, as we've heard today, to RO and FO, as well as solar desalination, and as a means of reducing the demand for energy when it comes to desalination. As you know, there is a real gas shortage in the region, and any desalination that can be reliant on less electricity is going to be a favoured option. As well as that, outside of desalination, we've got big drives to reduce unaccounted for water and to invest in water reuse and tighten up the networks. So those are going to be one of the major drivers in new projects. On the negative side, of course, we do have lower oil prices, which means government spending is restricted. So that as we've already seen last year, we're going to have a slowdown in new investment. We've also got reduced subsidies and higher tariffs, and that, which is probably a good thing, has meant that demand growth rates are decreasing, and therefore the amount of new capacity and the amount of investment required in projects is going to be lower, and therefore less investment required. And we still have an issue around billing and payments in some countries, and while we have developed most projects on a PPP, BOT basis, full privatization, where the private sector takes over the full cycle of investment in power and water in terms of billing as well and payments is still some way off. So finally, our current and future trends, as I said, we still need a lot more investment in power and water in the region. That's despite lower demand growth, that's despite lower oil prices. And as I said, this does also mean that demand growth rates are falling, not necessarily a bad thing, so investment levels may not be as high as they were predicted to be 2 or 3 years ago. There's going to be that ongoing move to membrane technologies, far less energy-intensive desalination and treatment technologies. Look out for solar desalination and nuclear desalination. Yesterday's announcement by Saudi Arabia does focus on small-scale nuclear reactors which can produce 40,000 cubic meters a day of desalination water. These are especially going to be prevalent in remote areas which are far away from transmission networks. We're going to continue to see a greater move towards PPP-type projects as to remove some of the strain on government finances, so expect that trend to continue. And it's not all about new investment in generation, desalination, it's also about investment in water networks, reducing UFW rates, building strategic reservoir systems, as we've seen with the Liwa strategic reservoir system in Abu Dhabi, and the water mega water reservoirs in Qatar. So it's also going to be about enhancing the networks as a whole. So that brings me to the end of that presentation. If you do want a copy, please give me your business card. I'll be here this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed that and it's given you plenty of food for thought. Thank you very much.